Thank you so much, Jenna, and thank you so much to the Rumi Forum. I'm delighted to be here tonight and to welcome Maureen Fiedler. And it's just such an honor to be here. As a fan for many years, I'm thrilled to be able to turn the tables on the interviewer and do some interviewing myself. So my name is Melody Fox Ahmed. I'm the Director of Programs and Operations at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. I am just such a big fan of the Rumi Forum. The work that Emre and Jenna is doing is reaching so many, and it's truly impacting dialogue and enhancing understanding in this world, which is needed now more than ever. So thank you again to the Rumi Forum, and we are delighted to be here. So it's my true honor to introduce Maureen, who is, first of all, a fellow Hoya. She is a graduate of Georgetown. She has her PhD in government. I also have my master's degree from Georgetown, so I'm delighted to be here in that context. Maureen is the host and creator of Interfaith Voices, the nationally acclaimed radio station radio show on NPR. She is a national advocate for human rights, social justice, women's rights, and peace. Her work is insightful, inspiring, and illuminating. She's literally breaking apart the stained glass ceiling piece by piece to let the light of groundbreaking women leaders shine through. And we are here today to discuss this in her new book, aptly titled Breaking Through the Stained Glass Ceiling. And I believe we have copies, which you can all get after the talk, which is wonderful. So we'll talk in detail about the book, but just to start, I wanted to quickly mention a few things that some leading interfaith voices have described, how they have described her book. Rabbi David Saperstein said, in bringing together a stunning array of some of America's most influential and inspiring religious women's voices, Maureen Fiedler captures both the frustrations and inspiring progress on the path to full gender equality. Very important. Then we hear from Asma Udin, who's the editor-in-chief of altmuslimah.com. And she says that Maureen sees not just the beauty, but also the difficulties, the core commonalities, and the delicate differences. And then a final thought from the Right Reverend Jane Holmes Dixon, Episcopal Bishop of Washington, retired, said, "This book is life-transforming for showing us that women as well as men are truly created in the image of God. This book of religious women's stories makes my heart sing, and I believe it will do the same for you." So I'm delighted to get a chance to hear the stories and to let all of you hear your heart sing through hearing Maureen talk about them. And so we'll get right into it. One final thought, I was at an event recently where a rabbi said that the opportunity to sit down and listen to another human being in civility and dialogue is something that's truly missing in American life. Maureen brings this to the nation, to the world, through her show every week, and how wonderful that we have the opportunity to sit down with her tonight. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to Maureen and let her speak a bit about the book.
All right, I will do that. Thank you so much, Melody. And I want to thank the Rumi Forum for inviting me to come here tonight to share some of the thoughts on this book with you. And what we're going to do is I'm going to talk for maybe 10 minutes, enough to try to get the basic thesis of the book on the table. And then Melody and I are going to kind of converse for a bit after that, and then we're going to throw open the floor to you, if that's okay. I've been a feminist since I was about 11, I think, as it says in the book. I can remember at about age 11 watching my mother iron clothes. I actually talk about this in the book. And I can remember, and she was one of these people who ironed everything that could be ironed, you know, curtains and bed sheets. I mean, you know, stuff I would never dream of ironing. And I can remember God bless you. And I can remember thinking then, you know, is this my future? And not being able to envision myself doing that sort of thing for a lifetime. It's not that I had anything necessarily against it, but I didn't see myself doing that full time. And there are many more stories that go with that. But, and a lot of them are in the introduction to the book. Probably one of the, I will say one, happened at my high school graduation. And I'm a Catholic. I went to a Catholic high school. And when I was a sophomore in my hometown, Lockport, New York, a girls' school and a boys' school merged. They were both Catholic schools. Of course, the priest became the principal. You know, nobody asked those questions in those days. This was This was in the late 50s when they merged. Well, when I got to be a senior, I was eligible to be the valedictorian. And the priest, the principal, called me into his office and told me I could not give the speech because I was a girl. This was 1960. Now, the women's movement had not been heard from at that point. And I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned. And so, first of all, I went home and talked it over with my mother, whose major advice in life was do not get into a fight with a priest. All right? But I decided my mother was wrong. It wasn't that I wanted to fight him, but I did want to challenge him. So I went back the next day and I said, Father, this is wrong. This is unjust. I have earned this. And furthermore, it's going to look perfectly terrible on the front page of our local paper. I gave the speech. So that just gives you some background as to why I'm interested in this topic. And let me just say now, the basic thesis of the book is really that women are emerging as leaders in the world of religion, just as they are in many other professions and walks of life across the board. And it's a trend that I think needs to be noted. I mean, many people have looked at the ascendancy of women in politics, the fact that we now have 3 justices on the Supreme Court who are women, the fact that women have risen to important roles in academia, in the business world, etc., all of these roles. And as I say in the book, once you've got a woman who's Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and you've got Hillary Clinton as a credible candidate for President of the United States, being a bishop in a church doesn't look like a big deal anymore. And so we've had a cultural groundwork laid, I think, for the ascendancy of women into leadership roles in faith traditions across the board and in multiple roles. I want to say something more about that. For one thing, I am not talking here about leadership strictly as elected or appointed denominational or organizational leadership, although there certainly is some of that. We have, for example, Bishop Catherine Jefferts Schori, who's the, not just any old bishop, but the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church USA. And somebody that I've not only interviewed, but have had the pleasure of conversing with a couple of times since. We have many women who are bishops in mainline Protestant denominations. That's common. We have women who have headed all the major rabbinical associations, except in the Orthodox Judaism. And anyway, so, but it's not just those roles. Women are, excuse me, women are prominent in theology and in scripture studies, in whatever scripture it would happen to be. Women are prominent as leaders in peace, justice, and ecology, which is certainly very important in our world today. They're leaders in the world of spirituality. That actually is probably an arena, it would be fair to say, that's never really been closed to women. But they're now very prominent in the publishing world in spirituality. They're much more likely to be called upon to be keynote speakers at conferences, to, you know, be asked to talk at various gatherings around the country or even around the world. So that's another area where women are in leadership. In interfaith relations, women are leaders, and certainly in religious media. So in other words, the roles are multiple, and it does hit faith traditions across the board. It's a growing, emerging phenomenon. Now, I think it's interesting to note, most religions like to think that we ought to be, and I say we because I think of myself as a religious woman, the prophetic leaders when it comes to justice in the world. And I would like to submit, I don't think we have been when it comes to gender equality. The prophetic leadership on this has come from secular life. And what has happened is we have become acculturated to seeing women in leadership roles in many walks of life. And now it's becoming easier in the world of religion. And I think that's what we're seeing. Now, I also want to say very clearly, as I do in the book, this is an emerging trend. It's an important trend. We have not hit nirvana. There are many faith traditions, starting with my own, that continue to have major stumbling blocks when it comes to gender equality. You know, in my own tradition, Catholicism, women cannot be ordained even as deacons, much less priests or bishops, all right? And certainly there are roadblocks in Islam, as many of you know. But in both of our traditions, there are serious challenges from women who believe that the traditions that we represent, the finest of those traditions, call us to practice gender equality. The same would be true of Mormonism. The same would be true of the Southern Baptists, who used to have women pastors, and then they decided, well, they didn't think that was probably right, and so they won't ordain women pastors anymore. So, but that's kind of unusual. In most of Protestantism, women in the ministry and women pastors are fairly common, actually, in most places in the country. So that's the growing trend that I document, and I think that I'll close with this. Again, it's a story from my own life. I was an all-day, everyday activist for the Equal Rights Amendment for a number of years. This was back between 78 and 82. I founded something called Catholics for the ERA and ran that for about 4 years. And at the end of the time, I was one of 8 women who fasted for 37 days in Springfield, Illinois for the Equal Rights Amendment. And I can remember how it felt when it was not ratified. You know, here you were, you gave it your all, literally, and we didn't make it. I've started to revise that opinion. I think in a certain sense, we've culturally ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, that's not to say I don't think we need it legally. I think we do. But I think as the culture has grown, it definitely, we've ratified it at a different level than equality. And let me say, and this is going to perhaps surprise some people, one of the places I find it most clearly right now is on the far right in American politics. When you look at women like Sarah Palin, Christine O'Donnell, Sharon Engel, you know, the governors running for Senate, etc. You know, these personally are not people I would agree with on anything I can think of. But I don't hear anybody, including in their own camp, saying they really belong at home taking care of the kids and cleaning house. And that is a victory. And I think that I would like to celebrate that, you know, because gender equality happens not just as racial equality happened, not just when the progressive people can be leaders and can run for office. It's when people of different persuasions can do this and they can be recognized in leadership roles. So anyway, with that, let you ask me some questions.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think that's so right that the book celebrates the victories, but it clearly shows how much there is to do, and that these women face struggles, they face difficulties. It hasn't been an easy path, much as even though Maureen has accomplished so much, it hasn't been an easy path. There's been challenges and struggles along the way. I guess to start off, this book has such amazing, so many amazing women in it. It gives voices to those who have not yet been heard. How did you choose these interviews out of so many in your life? How did you compile this book?
Well, these interviews happened over about 7 or 8 years. And generally speaking, it was when something emerged in the news or someone brought them to my attention. Bishop Catherine Jefferts Schori, certainly. I mean, this was a landmark event when she became the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, and when she published a book. Certainly, I'm always looking for women who are provocative theologians, like Rita Nakashima Brocken, Rebecca Ann Parker, who names you may not know, but they told me something I had never heard. I've been a Christian all my life. The crucifix, that is to say the image of the cross with the corpus of Christ on it, cannot be found before the year 1000 in Christian art. The plain cross can, but not the, and they write a whole book on the theological significance of that. So I'm always looking for that. And of course, people in the news. Helen Prejean is in the book, you know, certainly the leader in opposition to the death penalty. Women in spirituality. And of course, I've run into a number of Muslim women in the course of the work that I do who I just enjoyed reading enormously. Amina Wadud and Ingrid Mattson and the Murshidats of Morocco. Fascinating women.
Yeah.
I could go on and on.
That's great, thank you. You mentioned being surprised by the story of the crucifix. So I imagine you've learned quite a bit about faith and religion through these interviews. I myself learned so much. The story of Junia, who's a forgotten apostle in the Gnostic Gospels who was rewritten in history as a man. I guess I'm wondering, how have these interviews inspired your faith, changed you, caused you to question or reflect perhaps more deeply on your own spirituality and faith in God?
Well, I think each one of these women I find inspiring in her own right. And each of them kind of inspires me in a different way. Some will inspire me to read more deeply in religious scholarship, you know, books of theology, learn more about my faith or other faiths. Others will inspire me to greater action for social justice. And some of them give me insights into the breadth of spirituality. I'm thinking there of Julia Butterfly Hill. You know that name? She claims no religious tradition, and yet she's one of the most spiritual women I ever interviewed. She sat in the redwood tree in California for 2 years to save the redwood. She's an ecologist. You know, a leader in the field of ecology. But it was out of a deep spiritual love of the planet, of the earth, of the tree that she did that. I was totally moved by that.
No, that was an amazing story. And it, you know, she acted for something that she believed in so deeply, much as you did with the Equality Act. What other opposition have you faced in your life as you've worked for social justice, worked for peace, just held tough conversations and really been out there speaking about this? What difficulties have you had, and how have you drawn on your faith to face them?
Well, I actually have drawn a lot on my faith to face them. I think I've been a part of the struggle for the ordination of women in the Roman Catholic Church since 1975, something like that. That's 35 years. And needless to say, nothing has budged on that front. And you constantly run into, you know, discouragement is probably the most, because you keep wondering, where are the levers of change? Where is, because, you know, when you look at Protestant denominations, they mostly have elected bodies within them that can change policies like that. There is nothing similar in the Roman Catholic Church. And yet, we did have the Second Vatican Council in the early 60s, but it didn't make a change in the role of women, although it did say some very positive things about the role of women. But in order to continue that struggle, actually interviewing these women keeps giving me heart.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the interviews really highlight the capacity of women religious leaders to move from dialogue to action. There's an amazing interview on Christian and Muslim women in Liberia who created a nonviolent interfaith movement of public prayer and protest, which effectively ended the bloody civil war in Liberia. So what other examples stand out to you that women and men can learn from on actually how to move from dialogue and prayer to action for social justice?
That's one of the strongest ones. Lema Bowie in Liberia, and who was just an ordinary housewife and decided to organize Christian and Muslim women who didn't know each other, didn't trust each other, to do public prayer together. And they overthrew the dictator Charles Taylor and were highly instrumental in the election of the first elected woman president on the continent of Africa, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia. And I had the great pleasure of meeting Lema Bowie a few months ago. Oh, what a powerful woman. I mean, you know, Nelson Mandela move over. I mean, she really is quite an inspiring woman. The other African woman in the book that I was totally moved by was Immaculée Ilibagiza. She's Rwandan, And her family was killed in the Rwandan genocide. She wrote a book called Left to Tell. She's written another book since. She talked about how she used prayer to forgive the killers of her family. And it was like, oh my God, if we could ever find a way to duplicate the spirituality she talked about, we could have peace in the world. You know, because there's so much that needs to be forgiven, and there are so many grudges that get held for generations over whole peoples, and yet through the depth of herself she found a way to forgive. Breathtaking.
Absolutely. You mentioned Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman president of Liberia. This book is full of firsts. First rabbis in the Orthodox traditions, first women who have led mixed gender Islamic prayer, first bishops in various traditions. One of the women, Ingrid Mattson, who is the first woman and also the first convert president of ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America. She has a great interview, and she talks about how history has been conveniently rewritten to leave out or ignore the fundamental contributions of women who historically had authority, who historically had very powerful positions, much more prominent roles than they do now. How do you think this history can be recovered and really lifted up as an example to women to show that they haven't been marginalized all their life, that they're really maybe not so much creating new ground as reviving a proud tradition?
Well, it is happening in Christianity, and I'm not sure, it probably is in Islam and Judaism as well, but I'm not as familiar with that. But certainly the early centuries of Christianity, I mean, we were told growing up, you know, hey, women never did these things, they never led the Eucharist, they never did. Well, women have started to research those early centuries, and lo and behold, women hosted the Eucharist in their homes, in house churches, because that was the only safe place for Christians to worship in the Roman Empire when they were being persecuted. And so women led those services. I myself have been to the catacombs in Rome, where you can see icons on the walls of women in this position leading prayers in front of a table that clearly has a chalice on it. And in fact, one of the churches there, the Church of St. Praxedes, I think it is, you can find an image of a woman over a doorway, and she's one of a few, and it says under her name, under her image, Episcopa Theodora. Well, Episcopa is the Latin word for bishop, and an A on the end means it's feminine. And you can see that somebody has tried to scratch out the A. You know, but there is proof. And they've also even uncovered letters from popes as late as the 5th century complaining that women are still celebrating the Eucharist. So you get the idea very clearly that there was more going on than gets reported officially.
How do you personally reconcile these patriarchal restrictions in sacred texts, in your own personal faith, Roman Catholicism, with your work in the field of theology and spirituality? Do you find yourself reinterpreting your faith, engaging the text in a new way? And what are some other examples of women doing this that resonate powerfully with you?
Well, I think, you know, it would be fair to say that my faith is not dependent upon what the Vatican says. My faith as a Christian is, for me, dependent upon what the Gospels say and what Jesus teaches. And I find absolutely no contradiction in that. And in fact, I find major support for the equality of women, because Jesus dealt very easily with women. And I know Muhammad did too. I mean, this is, you know, I've had many Muslim women talk about, for example, the wives of Muhammad, who were highly accomplished women, and he dealt with them quite easily. I don't think, he doesn't sound to me like he was threatened by them or anything like that. And so, but in my own tradition, I find a lot of support in the scriptures for that. And, you know, it should be fairly said that most Christian theologians today find no barrier in scripture to women assuming leadership roles in Christianity or ordination or anything like that. It's, I think I can fairly say, because I've been with this movement for so long and I've read so much on it, the arguments have been answered. You know, the arguments come down to, you know, well, Scripture didn't say it, and, you know, we've never done it before. They've all been answered. We have done it before, and et cetera. It's really more entrenched patriarchy that's the problem.
What would you say to somebody who says that feminism is a luxury, that it's really the place, it's the domain of women in the West who have the time to focus on it, the resources to focus on it, maybe a Muslim woman in a country who is struggling to put food and water after a devastating flood, doesn't have time to worry about whether she should be an imam. Do you think that this is a debate that might come to her eventually, or do you think that the kinds of debates that the American women who are reinterpreting their scriptures, do you think it's a luxury or is it a necessity?
It's a necessity, without a doubt. It is the women who believe in women who have informed the world that the majority of the poor of the world are women. The majority of the victims of violence in the world are women. It's they that are deeply, and that's not to say that there aren't a lot of men that are concerned about this too. There are. And there are male feminists. I certainly know a lot of them, and that's to their credit. But women especially, I think, have real feelings for their sisters who are in struggle. And feminism is not a luxury. It's you know, any more than eliminating racial injustice was a luxury. You know, it's going to help the women on the bottom more than anybody else. So,
I think you'd agree with Catherine Marshall, who's a faculty member at Georgetown I work with, who works a lot on gender issues. She said that the biggest revolution of our time is the changing relationship between men and women, even more complex than race relations. So, would you agree with that?
I agree with that. Yes, yes.
And then
they're both complex, but
yeah, very complex. And then how could a woman from a faith tradition who's already overcome patriarchal structures, such as a woman who has become an Episcopal bishop, reach out to a woman who hasn't had that opportunity, such as a woman in rural India who wants to become a prayer leader? How can women reach across the divide?
Well, this is where interfaith dialogue is wonderful, because I think it's important. It would be important to that woman in India just to learn about what that Episcopal woman bishop is doing, maybe in the United States or whatever, and just to share that. It's also wonderful to visit and to perhaps sit down and pray together across the lines of faith traditions, which is certainly possible, and begin to listen to each other's experiences and stories. And that's one of the things I think that's so wonderful about the internet and a lot of the media, insofar as it's accessible, but a lot of it is in some of those areas of the world. These stories are getting spread, and they're getting better known even in remote parts of the world.
So would you agree that new social media has the power to positively influence interfaith dialogue? A lot of people argue that you can only have dialogue face to face, and the instant nature and sort of the anonymous nature of the internet and digital communication, really you can't have dialogue. What would you say about that?
I think anybody under 30 would disagree with that, and I'm not under 30. But in my religious community, for example, I'm going to be a Roman Catholic nun, among other things. We just had a community-wide meeting on WebEx, where we had people live in Kentucky and a major screen set up in Denver, Colorado, and another one in St. Louis, Missouri. And the meeting was held across the country without people in the other two cities traveling, and the technology worked beautifully.
So that's probably a way to get the Episcopal woman bishop to talk to the rural prayer leader in India.
That's right.
Maybe that will happen one day.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So thankfully, you know, we're committed to interfaith dialogue. The Rumi Forum is committed to interfaith dialogue as a value, but there are those who criticize interfaith dialogue as something light, as something fluffy, something Pollyanna. It doesn't engage serious differences. What would you say to those people? Often I see this in the media.
Yeah. Well, if it doesn't engage serious differences, it is light and fluffy, you know, and it's not that there can't be some kind of a search for commonalities. I think that's good. But there are differences. Stephen Prothero, as you may know, has written what I regard as a very important new book called God is Not One: The 8 Rival Religions That Run the World and Why Their Differences Matter. And he's not opposed to interfaith dialogue by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, he's a leader in it. So I think that we do need to engage our differences, but he analogizes this to interracial dialogue. You know, it isn't enough for people, or it wasn't enough for people to sit down and say, well, we're black and we're white and we're really all the same and da 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 da. You know, and what you're eliminating there is the magnificent, rich heritage that comes from both cultures and both racial heritages, or multiple racial heritages. And the same thing would happen with faith traditions. There are real differences. They need to be plumbed, but they can also be celebrated. And, you know, I'm finding when I interview people, especially young people, I swear some of them are inventing their own religion. You know, they're discovering the beauties in different faith traditions. And it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And, well, we've got a crucifix here and a statue of the Buddha here, and we've got etc. And that's happening. They're seeing the richness in those different traditions and making their own, for whatever that's worth.
And how about getting the media to cover these stories? You're a media leader, and you mentioned that women currently dominate reporting on religion in the media today. Do you think that the religion beat will become more mainstream? How do we get it to be picked up and reported on more, especially the positive stories rather than the conflict, the violence?
Well, it is a much more important beat than it used to be. 9/11 changed that dramatically. And I was just at the Religion News Writers National Conference in Denver, Colorado. And more than 50% of that organization are women, and they hold very prominent roles. I mean, Lori Goodstein of the New York Times, Barbara Bradley Haggerty of NPR, you probably hear, Krista Tippett, myself, etc. It's and I think that many of those stories are getting picked up. I think they're starting to get picked up in media.
Yeah, I think that's what we need to hear, is these positive voices. And especially to reach young people, because young people are so interested in the media and new social media, and they need to see that things can happen sort of on a more instantaneous level than in the past. What's your advice for young leaders, for young women leaders, on being unafraid to embrace diversity and pluralism and really get their message out there? There's a great interview in the book with 3 young women who started an interfaith club when they were in high school, and just what a great forum to be featured in a book. You know, I'm sure they'll take this work with them throughout the rest of their lives.
Yes, one young woman, Nafis Ahmed, who actually interned with my show, with Interfaith Voices for a summer, and she brought this to me. She said, well, you know, we've got an interfaith club at my high school. And her dad is Dr. Akbar Ahmed. That's, you know, the little bit of influence from Dad there, I think, on the work. Excuse me. And she said, now, and I said, well, you organize it, Nafis. Well, within a week she had it organized. And so we had a teenage interfaith dialogue, and it was wonderful. And so I'd encourage young people to do things like that and to become involved. I love the model of Ibu Patel of the Interfaith Youth Corps, where he brings young people together, not just to talk, but to work. And to work on like social service projects there, where they all have their heart in common. And then they sit down and talk about how their faith informs what they did.
Right.
And it's highly successful.
Yeah, I think common events, common goals is a way to do it. And you mentioned 9/11 and just the impact that it had on your personal life, on your show. Your show actually started after you did an interfaith show right after 9/11.
That's right.
Can you tell us about that and how the trajectory has changed? Do you think we have made progress? Do you think we still have a ways to go? Where does religious pluralism stand?
Sometimes I wonder if we've made progress after the past few months, but right after 9/11, I had a commercial radio show, but it wasn't going very well. And so we were thinking of going to public radio. And then all of a sudden 9/11 happened, and that was a Tuesday. By Saturday, we had organized a 3-hour call-in show on 4 public radio stations in major cities. And it was called Religion and Terrorism. And we had a whole bevy of guests from different faith traditions. But the thing I remember most clearly that night, this was actually Rabbi David Saperstein, who came in with a press release. And it showed me what interfaith, not just tolerance, that's weak, but real collaboration means. He had a press release and he said, "We are here to stand with our Muslim sisters and brothers." He said, "We are Jewish people who know what it means to be persecuted, who know what it means to have our faith reviled, who know what it means to be scapegoated, and so forth. And he said, and we will not stand by and let that happen to our Muslim sisters and brothers. I was like bowled over. I tell that story every chance I get. That was the beginning of Interfaith Voices. But then I look at the last few months when we've had, you know, the brouhaha in New York over the Islamic Center near Ground Zero, and then this lunatic in Florida who wanted to burn the Quran. You know, where are we? What is going on? I thought we were getting better, and sometimes I'm not so sure. But people are using some of this social media to whip up this kind of feeling, and I think that's pretty bad. And let me say, you know, in public radio, you don't always take stands on issues. There's one issue we take a stand on. We're against bigotry, and we say so. And you know, specifically religious bigotry. I did commentaries on all of those events as they occurred. Nobody mistook where I stood.
Yeah, and that's very clearly evident in this book. This book is so strongly for social justice, for equality, for anti-bigotry of every kind. It's really powerful. So I think we're going to want to open it up soon to questions. I'll just do one final question. This is really hard. Was there one interview that you could put out as a favorite or that particularly resonated with you? There's just so many. There's everything from the woman who lived in a tree. There's Moroccan Mourshidats. Mourshidats.
Yeah.
These amazing women leaders in Morocco. American Muslims reinterpreting the Quran in their own ways. There's Wiccan perspectives. There's Native traditions. How do you choose one? Can you?
It's hard to choose one because many of them are favorites in so many ways. But I must admit, I was taken by Lema Bowie of Liberia. You know, and it's because I actually interviewed her when she was on a cell phone in Ghana, if you can believe this. We never do interviews on cell phones if we can avoid it because you break up too easily. But for her, we did it. Okay. But then I got to meet her a couple months later when a local church in the Washington area was giving her an award. And I saw the power of this woman. This was a Seventh-day Adventist church. The congregation was mostly African American. So I was to introduce her, and I stood up and I said, this woman is in the tradition of Martin Luther King and Sojourner Truth and Nelson Mandela. And doggone it, she got up to the microphone and she was as powerful as anybody could possibly expect. She really came through. I can see why Liberia has changed, let's put it that way. This is a woman leader, and a woman leader of faith.
Wonderful. I'm sure you all have many questions, so shall we open it up?
Yes.
Great. Who wants to go first? This lady. And if you could introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I was raised by nuns. I went to a boarding school where nuns ran it, and I never got to thank them. So maybe if I thank you, they'll hear.
Where was that?
In Islam, Murray, Pakistan.
Oh, okay.
There, but I did want to say some. I mean, I've been listening to you, but I find it I find it problematic that I think that when you talk about change for women, what we're really talking about, it seems to me, is that how can a woman become more like a man? And I feel like the voice of a woman is not really coming through. So if you look at Hillary Clinton, I think that she doesn't represent really a woman, but a better man. Like, how can you, I mean, I just feel like Madeleine Albright, all of these, they really haven't done anything as a woman, for women. The same thing with integration. I don't really think, it seems on the surface that it's worked, but it hasn't really. Like, if you go to the jails, more than 70% of the people in there are blacks. You look at public schools in DC, they're the worst public schools because African Americans go to those public schools. And DC has the most private schools. I mean, you know, you were saying about like how can this woman who is a prayer leader in America approach a woman who is in India? But the thing is it necessary that the woman in India wants to be a prayer leader? So I feel like there are two types of things going on. There's a Western and a non-Western thing, and we just assume that whatever feminism in the West has sort of come up with is ideal, and that is what people in the non-West should also like go towards. And then there is a sort of gender thing, a male-female thing, where it seems to me women are always trying to get what men have had. But maybe we want something different. Like, why doesn't any woman anywhere ever talk about like menstruation and every month the pain we go through? Why shouldn't we get 3 holidays a month? I mean, nobody talks about those things. Why? Because men don't get them? Like, it's horrendous, it's painful, you're bleeding. Imagine if men had that happen to them. We know that they would get like 10 days before and 5 days after all. It's just, no, I mean, it's just, it makes me go crazy, because there is just this thing, there is an underlying problem that we are not facing, which is that maybe we don't even know how to fight for our rights as women, you know? And we only know that men have had this and we don't have this, so we should go and get that. Even with Amna Wadud, I mean, so she felt like she wanted to lead prayer. I sort of followed that debate a lot, and one of the most sort of nicest things that I read was a professor at Cambridge, Timothy Winters. He said it's not that theologically there's no, women are not forbidden from leading prayer, but culturally and traditionally that's not been done. And so we should try and maintain that. I think just trying to like, the point isn't that a woman should be able to lead prayer. There's something more profound, something deeper that should happen between the sexes, rather than this like, you know, it turns into this circus where like you get all this media attention and you're like this rebel and you're this radical, and I'm not sure it really serves the long-term purpose of like gender equality or racial equality, or, you know, those are my thoughts.
Well, first of all, equality to me does not mean sameness. It means that one is able to do the work to become a leader, to take an organization or a church or a denomination or a mosque or whatever, lead it in some kind of direction. Hopefully it would be collaborative leadership. There have been a lot of studies done, as you probably know, that women tend to be more socialized to more collaborative styles of leadership and men less so. That doesn't have to be, that's nothing genetic about that. But the socialization is there. And I would say that, you know, you were saying that maybe women don't want, well, if women don't want to be something, then they shouldn't aspire to it. Or they shouldn't, you know, but you know, a lot of us have been taught not to aspire to something. We have been, and you say that there's certain things in culture that have been there for a long time. That's true. That also is a problem. A lot of discrimination against African and African American peoples was also in the culture, and it was very deeply ingrained. I certainly would never argue that just because it's in the culture that therefore it needs to continue. Right now we're seeing incredible discrimination against immigrants in this country, and horrible things are being said. It's in the culture, but it needs to change. And I see that religious people, our job is to work to change that culture so that people become more accepting of the fundamental goodness and equality of all human beings, and that they're treated justly, that they have equal access to the goods of this world, or to positions where they have some kind of talent or can provide some kind of leadership. At least that's my perspective. I don't know if that helps.
No, of course. I understand that.
Yeah. And let me throw in something else. Nuns are in a very funny position when it comes to religious leadership, because we have been long, I mean, we can't be ordained to anything, but long before women in secular life were the presidents of universities or the administrators of hospitals, nuns have been doing that for decades. And nobody blinked an eyelash. But of course, a lot of these same women are not so stupid as to realize, well, what's wrong with being a bishop then? You know, there becomes a certain questioning that automatically goes on.
Yeah.
Why these roles? Why is the culture the way it is? And I would argue that, and this goes to what you're saying about gender relations being deeper even than race relations. It goes back millennia, I would argue, you know, and so thus a lot of this stuff is in the culture, but it is changing.
My name is Linda Creevy. I'm delighted to be here, and I too have heard you much on the radio.
Oh.
It's lovely to see you in person.
Thank you.
I'm an attorney here in D.C., but I'm very interested in the advancement of women in all sectors, and was very delighted recently when the White House, I think it was called the White House Leadership Project, issued a report on the advancement of women into the highest level of leadership in industry sectors, and I think it covered 15 sectors, including religion. And the thing that was disconcerting about it, unfortunately for me, was that while it looked at, in the legal profession, obviously, women becoming practicing attorneys and partners in law firms and things like that, when it came to the sector on religion, what it looked at was women achieving status of the pulpit rather than the status of a bishop. And it compared that to the advancement of women in the military to the status of a general. And I did not, and I was very confused by that. And when they looked at the data, the conclusion was that basically the advancement of women was basically the equivalent of the military, and that was, you know, basically 15% of women at the general level and 15% of women at the pulpit. But of course, if you look at the bishop level, the data is completely different. Now, I don't know whether it's just that they didn't understand. I doubt. These are smart people that wrote this report. I can't imagine that they did not understand that a woman pastor is not the equivalent of a military general. What I fear is that there wasn't enough data because there were so few numbers for them to make any projections if they were to look at the bishop at higher level, and so therefore they were stuck with the data where it existed. And excuse me, wondering if you could comment on that.
Right, maybe the reason, I did not see that report, so let me do that disclaimer, but it could be partly due to the fact that not all churches have bishops. You know, that is an office that exists in what? The Episcopal, Lutheran, Methodist, Catholic, and maybe one other church. But a lot of mainstream Protestantism doesn't have that office at all. Women are the pulpit, unless you're going to be head of the denomination, or over some kind of a region of the church, like the Presbyterian Church calls them a moderator, for example. There isn't any equivalent of bishop. But I don't know why they would equate a general in the military.
Well, that would explain
with the pulpit,
the
but
lack of data.
Yeah,
if you're saying
that's right.
The equivalent of a bishop position just doesn't
right.
exist.
And what counts as a bishop in Judaism? I mean, your average rabbi there isn't that kind of a structure in Judaism. There isn't that kind of a structure in Islam either. It's, you know, and in a lot of different denominations there isn't. Most of the evangelical world, a lot of people are self-proclaimed bishops there, you know, and even among Pentecostals and so forth. Like Bishop Eddie Long, the one that's in trouble right now in Atlanta, Georgia. Nobody ordained him a bishop. He started to call himself a bishop, and that also happens. So, but if you're looking at the 4 or 5 traditions in mainstream Protestantism that have that as an appointed or elected role, then you do have women moving into that across the board. But I don't know why that's more equivalent to the general officer of the military, I would think.
Thank you for your questions. Unfortunately, we have to wrap things up, but hopefully Maureen can chat a bit after. We have books for sale out in the hallway, which is great. And you know, thank you for the questions that opened up a window into the many fascinating debates that are possible through this book. So I'm going to leave with just one final question to Maureen, and just close with one thought. One other thing I heard, Rabbi Bruce Lustig at a recent event, he's the head rabbi of Washington Hebrew, just a wonderful man, and he said, you only find God face to face in dialogue with another human being, which I really loved, and I feel really sums up your mission and the beauty that you're bringing to us through your work. So thank you for that. And then just to close, what message would you like to leave for people, both those who have read the book and those who haven't?
Well, I think we can take a lot of hope from what's in the book, because we've got the lives of so many women who are giving such magnificent witness to the very different faiths that they represent, and yet the commonalities of justice and spirituality and so forth that are part of those denominations. And I think we need to celebrate the fact that human beings have become more accepting of this half of the human race that we call women, and that we're accepting it not just in secular life, but now in the realms of the sacred. And I think God would be pleased. She would.
Thank you. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you to the Rumi Forum.